Well, I can speak now to somebody who has experienced firsthand some of the issues in the UK's housing system and has since become one of the country's most prominent housing activists, Kwajo Tweneboa. It's great to have you on the programme. I think it was last year that we last spoke, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And Kwajo is someone who has the ear of government. You're always in and out meeting people. Just to introduce yourself to viewers who might not be familiar with yourself and the kind of campaigning you do, why did you end up being drawn into this kind of activism?
Well, I started off, I lived in social housing and I was living in poor quality social housing with my sisters and my dad. And we were complaining to our landlord at the time, who just simply didn't listen. My dad became ill with cancer, passed away in those conditions, and I had to turn to social media in order to disgrace my landlord, not only my landlord, but other social housing tenants, landlords too, into carrying out necessary works.
And I know you're the sort of person who is always amplifying the voices of other people who are currently living in these conditions, but just describe the conditions that you and your family were living in.
I mean, damp, mould, cockroaches, mice. We had a kitchen that was nearly 100 years old, poor security. We had lights filled with water, you name it. I mean, the list goes on. And since then, I've been contacted by people in social housing, but also the private sector too, living in slum conditions in a lot of cases whilst paying extortionate rents. I mean, we know around 3.2 million people have said in the private sector they have lived at some point in disrepair.
I think it's really important to talk to people like yourself, actually, because I do think that there is a tendency in the Westminster bubble, whether it's journalists, politicians, you name it, for people to reflect on their own experiences, right? And actually, that's not always the norm and what people are actually experiencing, as you say, like across the country. What do you make of what the government's doing today? Do you think it's going to help?
I definitely think it's going to help. I mean, it's a long time coming. People have been asking and begging for changes in regulation, the Renters Reform Bill, for the private sector for a very, very long time. So it's very welcomed, especially with the ban on no-fault evictions. That's something people have campaigned on for so long, and just the idea of tenants being evicted with no reason in a lot of cases. I mean, for shelter, for example, there was a 143% increase in no-fault evictions in the last year alone. So that just goes to show how big of a problem it is. And the introduction of an ombudsman service, for example, I mean, with the scrap of no-fault eviction, that doesn't mean that landlords can't still evict tenants. I wanted to make that clear because I think there has been some confusion. What it means is they have to have a valid reason in order to do so. Having said that, with this legislation, I definitely think at the moment there are current loopholes. For example, yes, we're scrapping Section 21, but what we're seeing is landlords can still evict tenants, for example, if they want to move a family member in or if they default on their rental payments. Now, what can happen in this situation with bad landlords? They can then choose to up the rent, for example, make it so unaffordable tenants default and then evict them that way. Or, for example, just say they're going to move a family member in and then the tenants have to move out. So the government definitely needs to tighten up these loopholes to make sure if landlords are evicting tenants, they're for the right reason and they're honest about it.
You made the point as well about funding as well, and say that look, there needs to be funding for enforcement for this to work.
Absolutely. I mean, that's my biggest point. I think it's all good and well having this all written on paper and having this bill discussed in Parliament, but fundamentally what we're relying on in order to regulate this is local authorities. Now, with local authorities, we've seen them underfunded over the last 13 years massively. We've seen the state of social housing run by some local authorities, and now what we're asking is for them to manage 2.2 million landlords too. I think the biggest challenge for Michael Gove now is whether or not he can get the funding to do so. If the Department for Levelling Up doesn't have it, then he has to go to the Chancellor and Prime Minister and convince them that that is the right decision to make.
Just a bit more widely as well, it feels that there's a big debate going on in Westminster about house building and whether or not it should be on the green belt, whether or not local people's concerns should be overridden. What's your take on that?
From what I've seen as a campaigner over the last 2 years and the conditions people are having to live in, the rates of homelessness, people in temporary accommodation, I understand people's concerns, especially about the green belt, but simply we have a crisis here and a crisis that has existed for decades. We need more homes. If that means, unfortunately, that we have to build on pockets in the green belt, then I absolutely think we need to, because what is the other alternative? We need more homes fundamentally.
And then just a bit more widely as well on the cost of living. It always shocks me when I look at rental inflation, right? And also the percentage of people's pay packets that they end up spending on rent. What is going on in the private rented sector, do you think?
People are really, really struggling. I mean, I've spoken to tenants that have to borrow off their kids because they simply cannot afford on their wages to pay for their rent bills, fuel bills and everything else on top of that. We've seen how much food, for example, has gone up. And they are really, really struggling at the moment. I think what is kind of ironic for me is the fact that government is talking about home ownership and pushing home ownership whilst we're in a cost of living crisis and people are struggling to pay their rents. And rents, especially in London, are currently unaffordable for so many. In terms of one bedroom, for example, £1,000 per month is their average. If people can't afford to save, how does the government expect them to get on the ladder? And especially during a cost of living crisis too, when people are struggling. That's the issue you need to, or they need to be dealing with, is bottom-up approach, not top-down.
What do you make of Labour's sort of policies on it? Do you have optimism, I guess? Or...
Yes, I mean, it's really, really interesting, I think, from both parties to see them talking about housing. For a long time, I don't think it's been discussed enough. I think housing is becoming very, very prominent and will be huge at the next general election. Whether or not they are going to make the right decisions and focus on the things that people are calling for most is still up for debate, I think. But I really, really hope they do listen to the people. If they're going to create well-informed policies, they need to be informed by people affected currently by the current situations.